All right, I think we should go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to the fifth and final talk of our material histories of the Indo-Ocean world, 1500 through present, methods and challenges series. It's been a lot of fun hosting this one, and we are so excited that there is so many of you who have come every week or to multiple talks to spend time with us and to build this community, not just here. We have great conversations happening in the chat usually, but also there's a lot of engagement on Twitter. So if you are engaging with us on Twitter, please use the hashtag IOW Material Histories webinar histories as the hashtag. I've just put that in the chat window, just in case you're interested in doing that. We are also thinking about how to continue to engage this community that we've built here. So if you have ideas, please do share with me. I also, we're thinking about making shorter video contents which are focused on material objects of the Indian Ocean world. So if you have a story about a material object from the Indian Ocean world, please let me know, and then we can collaborate on doing some video content that we are thinking of releasing every week as short snippets to keep this engagement going. We also have a Google form that I have put together. Dan's going to put a link of the Google form in the chat right now. Thanks, Dan. That form is basically for feedback, but also to ask you of the different ways in which you would like to continue to participate and engage with this community that we're building here. If you don't want to fill out the form, I will still send you an email with the form and the recording for this particular talk. So once again, thank you so much for being here and being part of this community. I've had so much fun hosting these. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you the final talk of the IOW Material Histories webinar series. In the series, we have our speaker is Dr. Urmila Mohan, who is an anthropologist and curator of material culture and religion with a focus on textiles and Hinduism in India and Indonesia. She is an honorary research fellow at the Department of Anthropology, University College London. She's the founder and editor of the Jugaad Project. And in a second, I'll put a link for the Jugaad Project in the chat if you want to take a look. It's really great. She's the founder and editor of the Jugaad Project and has published on materiality, praxis, and aesthetics in the context of textiles, clothing, and religion. She curated Fabricating Power with Balinese Textiles in 2018, based on a Mead Bateson textile collection in the American Museum of Natural History. Her research has been funded by Victoria and Albert Museum in London, Asian Cultural Council, and Kobe Foundation, among others. She's a transdisciplinary scholar whose work across domains and geographies and who has worked across geographies and domains, and she draws upon her background in anthropology, design, and art to develop and teach courses that connect these different fields. In today's talk, she's going to actually reflect on her project, Curating the Textiles. There's actually, this is the book that came out of that project. This book is available on Amazon and other retailers, but also we have a review of the book in PDF form on our website if you want to go take a look at the book review. Most of her talk today is going to be on this idea of heritage and how we can think about heritage and all its complexities. It is a multivalent term and it has different meanings. In the process, she's also going to talk about maybe the politics of curating and the politics of collections of non-Western objects, Indian Ocean world objects in particular, in Western museum spaces. And hopefully she's also going to give us some insight into the responsibility and sensitivity sort of needed to make these curatorial practices more ethically mindful and responsible. So Urmila, thank you so much for joining us. Please take it away.
Thank you, Deepthi. Thank you also to the Roy Rosenzweig Center and to everybody at the center for making this possible, for giving me this opportunity to hopefully share my work with a new audience. Just a couple of caveats before I start. One is I'm not an Indonesia expert. Neither am I a textile expert. So if you are looking for that kind of really detailed, granular information, you won't find it. What this is more about is actually an intersection of different ideas and approaches. And perhaps it's at those intersections that we can find something fruitful. So this story actually rides on the back of the curation project that is from 2016 to 18 that was done when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Bard Graduate Center, across the Bard Graduate Center and the American Museum of Natural History. And the focus of the format of the postdoc was basically that it had to focus on some aspect of the museum collections. And I was looking at the Mead Bateson collection, which was the Mead Bateson collection in particular of textiles, which people had looked at, had known about. I certainly wasn't the first to have identified them. But this was the first time that there was some attempt made to contextualize these textiles or kind of look at them in a more in-depth manner. So as Deepthi said, the topic is both about the curation, but also a reflection going back to the site and looking at the project further as it's kind of transitioned into my own work right now as to what we think of this term heritage, a very complex term. Multiple positionalities, and of course, really lends itself to, a more of a political critique of these ideas. And this is the first time I've actually looked at the project from that perspective. So I'd be curious to know what your ideas are and hopefully learn from your feedback as well. So this is the framework of the project, and the archives I'm looking at are, again, there's a sense of folding, that there already is a book that's come out, which is Balinese Character. There's already an exhibit that's been done by Bateson called Bali, A Background to War, interestingly by MoMA. And the main archives I'm dealing with are the American Museum of Natural History, the Field Museum, and the Library of Congress, which is where Mead bequeathed her archives, especially her Pacific archives. So the bulk of the material for this research actually came from spaces, textual material for this research came from spaces outside the Natural History Museum, while the artifacts themselves came from the Natural History Museum. So this pretty much tells you what the challenge was, that we're trying to contextualize textiles from Bali. Bali is already a place that's been called the Imaginary Museum. We've got multiple histories, complex histories, Dutch colonial history, tourism, US anthropological history, that is the history of the field from which Mead and Bateson were approaching this topic of Balinese character or ethos. And of course, later you have, simultaneously and later you have the formation of the Indonesian state. And for the perspective in terms of approaching this literature, of course, we have post-colonial theory and new museology, which looks a lot more at the situatedness of the person who's doing the research and issues of power, inequity, social justice, and all of the other concerns from the late 1980s onwards that have found their way into museum anthropology and museum studies in general. So this is the site. Here's the island of Bali. We're looking at a time period in late 1930s when Mead and Bateson come there. By then we're looking at a late colonial Bali that is already being internationalized and where there's already wide-scale tourism and an island to which their own presence has been heavily facilitated by colonial powers. So this is certainly not it's not a bubble, right? This is a place that's already quite connected by steamliners and well known in the European world as a tourist destination. And going back to history, by 1908, we see the defeat of the royal family in Klungkung, and that's when Bali declares independence. Oh, sorry, that is when the Dutch Empire actually takes over Bali. So Indonesia finally becomes completely a Dutch colony. And that's when also we start to see this romance of Bali building. The two areas on the island where the research is going on is for Mead and Bateson is the 2 years they spent in Bayunggede, in Bangli, and also traveling to Ubud, even at that time, which was already a border zone, a border area, a border town with well known for its artists and performers and dancers. And when you go back now, Bayunggede is pretty much unknown, unmarked. And of course, Ubud is absolutely thriving as a place that most tourists, including me, would spend a lot of time in as a first stop in getting to know Bali, in addition to doing the Denpasar, Sanur, Kuta route. So that island of Bali that you see there is right there in the middle in the Indonesian archipelago. The area covered by the archipelago is massive. It would stretch from east to west of the United States, continental United States, if we were to spread it out. And of course, going back a little bit deeper into history, Indonesia is situated on these trade routes between China, India, Africa, and of course, as many of our previous speakers have touched upon, one of the major imports, textile imports from India was patola, different kinds of patola, and specific kinds being made for the Indonesian market. So you will see influences of those textiles on the Balinese textiles shortly. Just a reminder though that this is not a presentation about trade between India and Indonesia. So I'm welcome to talk about that later, but this presentation itself won't look at those textile items in detail. And here's the textile alcove in the Indonesia alcove in the Hall of Pacific People at the Natural History Museum. It dates pretty much from the 1970s as it was first installed, following the kind of prevailing paradigm of flattening these fabrics or hanging them as wall decorations. But in this case, quite remarkable just for the regimentation and just this tight pulling of fabric against various panels, which gives you a visual effect, but doesn't really tell you how any of these fabrics or textiles were intended to be used. So it kind of gives you an interesting position to work from. You have these textiles and textiles like these in the collection. What do you do to animate them? How do you make them relevant? Or how do you give them life in some way, if that is the conceit of the project? And so you have explicit themes, which is the Balinese textiles, which is the ritual context of these textiles. And then you have the implicit themes, of course, which you have a corpus, you have an archive, a series of archives behind the project, including Mead's and Bateson's fieldwork on Balinese personhood, which was the book that they produced, which was lavishly illustrated, about 30,000 photographs that they edited down. And of course, their work for visual anthropology is, of course, well known. But there were also other practices in other museums, which are worth noting, which are covered in the catalog. And as I spoke about the issue of reanimating these objects, how do you take these objects that have been put away in collections for 60 years or 80 years, and how do you recontextualize them for a new audience? So the implicit question was always, if this is a museum anthropology project, how do you reinterpret the Mead-Bateson project in Bali through the lens of the archives and through this lens of textiles supplemented with other objects like leather puppets, wooden offering holders, woven pandanus leaf or palm leaf offerings, things like that, to kind of try to give more of a context of how these textiles were used. And the context would be first trying to identify the different types of Balinese cloth. So definitely a very rich culture in terms of the weaving traditions, different types of simple weaves, different types of complex double ikat ginseng, weft embellishment, beautiful brocade cloths, and of course also the traditional Kamasan cloth paintings. The second point is the role of cosmology. So the point being that these textiles are not just simply garments, but they are garments with the function, or they are wrappers. You can think of them as wrappers, wrapping several kinds of bodies, earthly bodies, invisible bodies, spiritual bodies, and also as mediation, various kinds of mediation between the realms. The third thing that I also have to kind of keep in mind when I'm situating this is the broader ritual and religious context, which is Balinese Hinduism, deriving from long links, maybe from the 7th century onwards with India, South India, influences from Shaivism, of course, the legacy of Buddhism, and of course, the archipelago's certain common underlying ritual aspects such as ancestral worship and animism. And very simply put, the storyline was quite simple and basic. How are these cloths used in some rites of passage? That became the core way of reanimating these textiles and communicating their purpose. So the cloth that you see featured on the cover of the catalog is basically a chapuk, and you can find different forms of these in different rituals. We see it being featured at the cremation ceremony and at the tooth filing ceremony. And in addition, of course, there are various other textiles, but that's the one that was featured most strongly. So what we started with was with the story of creation. What is the role of weaving, and where do women fit in this story? And if you look at the left, you have this absolutely gorgeous, quite large, I would say about maybe 2.5 feet by 4 feet or 5 feet cloth, Kamasan painting, donated by Colin McPhee to the museum. And basically telling the story of cosmology. There you have the demons and the gods churning the ocean for Amrita. And in the center, you have, in the middle of the demon Kalarao's face, you have, he's trying to swallow the moon goddess, Devi Rati, who's also worshipped and known for being the patron of women who weave. So the story was always to try and talk about both the uses of these textiles and also gave a hint or a gesture towards the people who make these textiles. And a lot of this kind of recontextualization had to be done by actually going to Bali and doing it at the start of the project. So you've got to remember that all of this happened in the span of 2 years, which, as anybody knows, is extremely ambitious. So on the right-hand side, we have a weaver in Nusa Penida weaving chapuk on a backstrap loom, which, if anybody knows, if you've tried using a backstrap loom, is really not easy. It's amazing that you're able to create that tension and that patterning. And of course, she carries these patterns in her mind. The dyeing is done by her husband, who runs an enterprise where he has learned how to use natural dyes. And come back to the chapuk here in the context of, to give you an idea of how the cloth can be contextualized. You have this charming small baby wrapper on the left-hand side collected by Mead, which is no longer made in Bali, but has hints and resonances of the chapuk, and contextualized. A lot of the contextualization of this project was done through those photographs at the Library of Congress, trying to take those photographs, which you may have seen in the printed book of Balinese character, but seeing how they could be used as a way of contextualizing the textiles. And on the right-hand side, the contemporary chapuk that you saw being woven actually being used in a tooth filing. So a lot of the story was really about detailing and nuancing these connections and identifying these connections in the first place. So a lot of the storytelling was kind of located in that. Another way of telling the story was, for instance, having the rare archival trace of actually finding a note in the archives of Mead's notes, where she talks about collecting the textiles. Very, very few traces, and those are practically the only one I could find where she actually talks about the process or gives us a hint of whom the textile may have come from. And here you have the chest wrapper and the hip wrapper from this young girl, 1937, in her puberty ceremonial dress. And we have the actual wrappers in the Natural History Museum, and attempting to put these pieces back together to tell some kind of story through the archive. So different ways of using the archive, different ways of adding to it, and different ways of telling the story, but all adding up to the story of ritual usage. Again, continuing the same pattern of connecting objects, connecting my photographs, and connecting photographs from the 1930s, late 1930s, with again the scarce information that we have from the EM&H archives on the textiles themselves. Again, trying to show continuity, but also trying to frame it within the catalog itself and within the history of colonialism and the consciousness that there was these practices were continuing in the face of colonial either patronage or control. And finally, coming to the exhibit over here, you see several glimpses, several kind of perspectives on these rooms. It was a small exhibit. It was 3 rooms, and we tried to tell a lot. One room was about the making of textiles with some, I guess what you'd call showstoppers from different collections, including the Brooklyn Museum. Then over here, we see the large gallery with ritual textiles, and also the wooden offering bowl, trying to give a sense without being too illustrative of the different uses of these textiles. And of course, in the upper left-hand corner, we try to give the historical context of a lot of this collection, that is what was happening in Bali in the 1930s. As we talked about it, already an island that was acquiring a lot of interest. So that was the first half. That was the project being over and laying down the first layer of the story. After that, I got a grant from the ACC to go back to Indonesia, and I expanded the study to Java and Flores. And I think these questions that you see here are questions that I've been developing, percolating in my mind over the past 4 years, 4-5 years, as to what are the assumptions underlying these kind of projects? And what do you do when you're a person like me who's teaching new museology or teaching museum anthropology? How do you incorporate perspectives, contemporary perspectives on ownership of these objects and the ethics of doing this kind of work? And I'm thinking a lot about Christina Krebs's work on comparative museology, where she is, of course, asking these really important questions about, do cultures have their own forms of conservation and collecting and archiving, and what kind of purchase do they have? Do those forms of thinking and approaching the world where these objects are not separate or distinct, but part of a larger universe? And what does that approach to objects have to offer, perhaps not just Indonesia, but maybe the rest of the world? And the larger question for me has always been, where does something become heritage? What is the relationship between history and heritage? Whose history is somebody else's heritage? Whose heritage is somebody else's history? And our approaches from a post-colonial perspective, or maybe in the US from a settler colonial perspective, on identity, ownership of these objects, and who tells the story, and whether how collaborative are we really in the storytelling? And of course, with Saloni Mathur's prediction that we start to have universal museums, we start to have universal civilizational museums, we have universal ways of showing these objects. Do we really have autonomous spaces where these cultures and their activities exist? So just some underlying thoughts as I continue to think about this project, and certainly not anywhere near any kind of answer, but just an ongoing work in progress. So to go back, I think what became interesting was that the artifact in this case that I took back with me was the catalog. It was the book. It was wanting to take the book back to Marty Keller, who was the Balinese assistant for Median Bateson, 22-year-old young man whom you can see featured in the photograph in the center towards the left with his hand to his face. And his own story is untold. And his daughter, Dr. Hanari Keller, I was really happy to be able to meet her and give her a copy of the book and meet her family. I think that connection was important, and learn a little bit more about Marty's life after the Mead Bateson project. And it turned out that he had accomplished some pretty amazing things, including helping start a university for the arts in Bali. So I still think that's a story that if somebody is willing to tell that story, that would make a great project. The second part of kind of, if you could call it a reconnection, was the question of archives and access. So I've written this book. Very few people in Indonesia are going to be able to access this. It's also in English. And where do I take it? Who do I give it to? Which libraries do I put it in? So I took back around 30 copies and distributed it to libraries in Bali, in Java, and try to do my best to kind of get it to those libraries, at least as a first start. So that was my own little initiative to kind of create some kind of access to this information and give it to people whom I met there who I felt would benefit from it, whether institutionally or whether individually. In terms of heritage and tourism, what I was paying closer attention to the second time around was this double consciousness of playing with heritage, whether it is through studio photographs where you inhabit a different world, or you play at doing batik. You take batik classes outside as part of heritage experience, but you also play at it, you insert yourself in that world, whether it's nostalgia, whether it's entertainment. These kind of things become ways to re-experience textiles, to re-experience these artifacts. And that's a photograph from a friend. Another way I was myself participating in this whole heritage and tourism intersection was participating in these workshops where you go on a textile traditions workshop, you travel through the islands, you get to experience the techniques for yourself. It's a hands-on experience. I believe that they have these kind of experiences pretty much on all the islands where you've got textile traditions and collectors going there for decades. Very well-established kind of industry, you could say that. Now, this is not to say that the textiles are not beautiful or that they are not skilled or they aren't serious about what they're doing, but just to say that these are also being folded into a history of tourism and an idea of matching the desires and the images of what the visitor or the guest or the traveler brings with them when they come to Indonesia. And on the left-hand side, as a nod to Patola textiles, you have an example of a Lukasamba men's shoulder cloth from Flores. And there you can see a wonderfully reinterpreted Patola Chabari back pattern. So certainly striking, examples of the resilience of those Patola motifs and just amazing reinterpretations, amazing amount of creativity and innovation being shown in these textiles, but also being conscious of the other narratives surrounding these textiles beyond them being, say, examples of Indic influence or examples of Indonesian rituals. And just other examples of the ways in which these traces of early trade continue, whether it's the printed chabri bat in the waist wrapper of the Javanese bridegroom in the middle, or, again, a patola design, patola derived design being sold on Maliobero Street at one of those more upscale places. So these things continue as resonances, they continue as traces in new forms. And on the right-hand side, you have new kinds of rituals and practices where, especially for weddings, of course, people dressing themselves up as royalty, wearing a combination of grinseng, of songket, of these different kinds of textiles. So it takes you into a different phenomena of a ceremonial wear, but also consumption of fashion and of self-presentation. So a consciousness and pride of being Balinese, but situating yourself in a different way and using these textiles in a different way to say different things. And the last two slides I want to stop with really is two artists who I feel kind of embody the spirit of creativity in ways in which you also, I come back with an idea of the questions that they are asking about history. So we have Chitra Sasmita, who I situate in right now within this Kamasan painting tradition, because she works with Kamasan styles and paints on fabric. But she's quite clear that she's not painting for a ritual purpose, although there is a spiritual element to what she does. Now, in her case, there's very clearly, as a Balinese woman artist, perhaps one of the few, and we have Manko Muriati to the right-hand side, about whom Siobhan Campbell has written so beautifully many times. So those articles of Siobhan's articles definitely worth reading. But in that tradition, if we situate Chitra as a contemporary artist who's trying to break away from a number of other cultural norms like patriarchy, or even the struggle to live on an island where tourism, everything depends on tourism. So what is the space left for people like her to create their own identity? And she has basically done this by focusing on her pre-existing interest in women, women's strength, matriarchy, and doing this amazing series of paintings called Timur Mera, The East is Red, and in which she basically retells the story of history, retells the story of ancestors. So this is really interesting. What do we approach this as mythology? Do we approach this as contemporary art? So it questions also the notion of the dominance of a narrative, and also the gaps and absences in our own received wisdom as to what the history of Bali could be. The second artist, and the artist on the note of the project I would like to end the presentation, I think kind of vibes well with the overall theme of weaving and the ocean. And we have a Javanese artist who works across Bali and Canada's Ari Bayuaji. And he has been working with sculptural textiles, recycling painfully and processing these plastic threads that wash ashore. A lot of manual labor involved in cutting these ropes, processing them. And he now works with families in Sanur to reweave these into fabrics. And I think it's very poignant that it ends on this note of weaving and the ocean and connectivity, and simultaneously on a note of hope and optimism. So I'm just going to end with that last slide, which is hopefully a list of people who have been incredibly vital and important to this project. And I think I'll stop it there and take questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Urmila, for that wonderful talk. I have a couple of questions, and there, if you all have questions, if you could put them in the chat, that'd be great, and then we can call on you if you need to answer those questions. So, but to just get started, Carolyn Greer asks if if you could talk more about the role of cloth in the cremation rituals.
Carolyn, I'm just going to actually refer you also to the catalog and say that there are many layers to it, in the sense that if I was to follow the cremation rituals slowly, cautiously and carefully, I think that's something I would, you would find cloth coming back in so many permutations and combinations. So the short answer to your question really is that unfortunately at this point, I'm giving a very high level coverage of the topic. So I'd be really happy to converse with you. You can just shoot an email to me and I could really go into the details of that. And I really apologize for, not having that at the top of my head right now. But suffice to say that what we did see in this presentation was those moments when the textiles were forming some kind of a buffer or layer, denoting a certain layer of the body, of the spiritual body. So I don't want to say any more than that right now, because I think I'd be misspeaking and misleading. So happy to take your question at my email, um6@nyu.edu. Thank you.
I know Carolyn, she's from Mason, so I can connect the two of you. Also, someone in the chat just said, for ritual dresses, please study about the Toraja culture. I hope I'm saying that right. But I will actually take this information and actually put it separately in a chat, in text form for us to look at later on the website. I know that people are going to drop off, but before you all go away, I just wanted to thank all of you for coming and to continue to put your Q&A in the chat. But I had a question about Made Color. And can you talk a little bit more about his role and his sort of life experience as being part of these projects that I don't know if everyone here knows about him. So if you can just give a brief context to his life and his work, that'd be great.
Well, it's going to be very brief, but I'll try. So he was the 22-year-old secretary. That's the way he's referred to, the secretary. But I don't think that really does sufficient justice to who he was. I mean, he was a polyglot. He knew 5 languages. He was somebody they met in Bali and was recommended because he was a person who would actually do the translation between the people in the Balinese villages and Mead and Bateson, of course, who spoke some Malay or Bahasa Indonesia, but not really Balinese, even though they tried hard to learn it. So I think that the issue with Made is that he kind of features in all these photographs, and also there's a wonderful relationship. He was very appreciative of them. He was very kind of affectionate. There was always this warmth. You see it even in the correspondence between Mead and Made. So you won't deny that. But when you look at it from our lens, you start to wonder, well, what were his own desires? What was what was he looking at? And we also wonder, as a Balinese person of a particular caste, how did he feel when he was perhaps being put in situations where he had to mediate between the researchers or talk to somebody who was upper caste or lower caste or whatever? You wonder about that positionality and those stories. And it would be great if somebody could go back into the archives, into the photographs, and perhaps do a very methodical interpretation of that to see where he features and how he features, without kind of, just doing a hatchet piece. Thank you, Deepti.
Yeah. I just wanted to also ask one more question since I have you here. This is something that I've been thinking about asking you for a while, but if you had to pick up one portion of, your curatorial experience of putting together, this wonderful project, what was the most difficult aspect of it in terms of just the curatorial practice, but also what would you change if you had to?
think if I could, if I could change something, it would be maybe spend more time in the field, maybe have a longer period of immersion and orientation towards this project. Since this was completely new to me and having to kind of immerse myself very quickly. So I think that anthropological insight would definitely have benefited if I'd had more time in the field, also learning about these layers and getting more acquainted with the culture. And the first question I believe you asked, Deepti, was it about a particular object that you wanted to know more about?
Either. I'm just curious as to, like, what was the most difficult aspect of actually bringing this together, because there are so many moving parts, and and also critically, sorry, I just dropped my phone from which I was live tweeting earlier. So I'm just curious to know, because when you think about Balinese textiles, there's obviously this sort of aspect that you said you won't talk about, which is sort of its historic network relationships with the Indian subcontinent, all that that we can place in one place. But there's also sort of Indonesian subcultural groups that have their own networks, and then there is the colonial forces, and so and on top of that, you're looking at anthropological interventions, American interventions of the early 20th century in there. So I am sort of curious about, how did you prioritize which of those lenses to actually engage with?
Oh, I think prioritizing, honestly, was pretty clear just from the people who were funding the project. The priority was always going to stay on the Mead Bateson project.
Okay.
Right. In fact, that I was even able to pull away from it and tell so much of the story without just focusing on museum history. I mean, there are a couple of ways I could have told the story. I could have told the story without going to Bali, right?
Yeah.
I could have told the story by doing what was, if I may say so, what was also more, I think, easy and perhaps more acceptable. It would have been great for everybody if I had maybe made one visit and didn't try so hard to contextualize these textiles. If I didn't try so hard to find contemporaneous video, if I didn't try to create, connections with living traditions and trying to show that these were living textiles. And even though there had been road bumps and there'd been tremendous loss, that there was still threads of this tradition continuing. So the story could have been told without all of that. Mm-hmm. And it could have been still been a quote unquote museum anthropology project by sticking to museum archives. So I wonder if that kind of answers your question by flipping the question around that way, by saying that I think that the complication and the challenge really was trying to bring Balinese, or even to use that word also as a generic category, I realize is problematic, but trying to bring some kind of feel of the living culture to these objects so many thousands of miles away. I think that was the biggest issue when I talk about reanimating these objects. I think anybody who's worked with collections realizes that these objects are in archives where it's literally even getting to look at them is a question of access, right? So you're constantly jumping over these hurdles to even access these objects. So once you've got access, what do you do? What are the narratives that you re-embed them? And I think your point about multiple networks is very well taken. So you have the networks of late colonialism, you have the networks of Balinese rulers who were collaborating with the Dutch, you have the networks of subaltern views of Balinese history, which are only just being told right now. So in a way, it's almost like to even find those narratives would be a great second project, because we're assuming that those stories exist. And I wonder, in a way, if Chitra's project with the painting, with the mythological painting, is also her own response to her frustration as to not seeing those kind of subaltern stories being told. And we're just starting to see people talk about those things. The work has always been done, but the scholarship on it, like Siobhan Campbell's work on women artists, for example, that's a great kind of idea you could see ending up being a project.
Thank you. There is I have lost my thread because I was listening to you, but Christine Millier asked, what was the most in uh, challenging thing to do in challenging thing you faced in reinterpreting and contextualizing these objects? What were the main issues, if there were any, in terms of just specifically contextualizing and reinterpreting?
I think it's also like dealing with, I don't know if this answers your question, Christine, but I think the question also is working within the limits of the archive, working within the limits of my own experience, even with the generosity of multiple people in Bali and the US who made this possible, because you can't do this without networks. I think it is the unevenness of the archive, if I can use that word. Some aspects of a lot of information, for example, on cremation rituals, and you can find even the shroud, the Kajang shroud, kind of covered in this. A lot of information on that, a lot of information going back to Bali and participating, say, in a cremation ritual, but no information because of the way things turned out on a wedding ritual. So there's also this kind of unevenness of the archive where you have to kind of tell your story with also paying attention, but trying to make those bald patches and those gaps less visible and less noticeable, while also kind of paying attention to what Mead herself, Mead and Bateson themselves were writing and doing, because they collected specific objects with the intention of displaying. I mean, there's a wonderful series of wooden carvings, absolutely like charming wooden carvings of weavers and the whole process of weaving, which Mead had clearly commissioned, right? So she had commissioned someone to make this, which is very different from just going and buying it from a dealer or getting it from somebody in the village. So how do you deal with these different levels and these different routes of collecting, kind of trying to honor, to some extent, curatorial intent, while recognizing that the story you're telling it is to people who may not even know where Bali is. So I think that's, to answer your question, perhaps that is the most challenging thing. You've got the story, it could be a great idea, but is it really going to communicate with the audience that you have?
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting also because Tali, I hope I'm saying your name right. She has they have an important comment in the chat, which is about how local people view their own heritage very differently sometimes from what others think is important to preserve. And so have you had to think about that kind of friction about how the Western Museum sort of views these, in your case, in this exhibition, like the Balinese culture and their work, as opposed to what like the Western audience expects from these kind of exhibitions?
Absolutely right. I mean, if you just even start with the question of what is a museum collectible, like what is a museum worthy textile, right? What are the textiles that people were collecting? It's kind of interesting. On one level, you have to applaud Mead and Bateson that we're collecting what were considered ethnographic textiles. That these are very simple, very humble textiles that are just simple checks and simple weaves. And these were not the gorgeous songkets or the ceremonial outfits. And certainly those were not widely spread or were not even available in cheaper forms and formats like you can today. So this consumption culture that you have also right now, right? You have the pandemic, you have the problems, but you also have this increased emphasis on consumption, on display, on playfulness, on this playing nostalgia, playing those roles also. And those are all aspects of self-fashioning. And I think that causes the friction you're talking about. The way people also want to be seen and the way they present themselves is absolutely very, very different. So that would be a great vignette to actually say, okay, I see myself this way, or I present myself this way to you. And how do you see me? And I think, yes, for the most part, when you have these kind of textile exhibits in the West, they tend to focus on the beautiful stuff, the decorative, textiles have always been decorative art. So to even tell the story from an ethnographic viewpoint and say, okay, we are going to privilege this really simple cotton weave checks because we believe it has meaning, the color has meaning, the fabric has meaning. And trying to tell it through an archival record to say, to kind of push back and say, listen, it's not just about what the the tourists want.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much. Any other questions? I think we're done with the Q&A questions. I don't see any more. If I have missed any, apologies, but thank you, Urmila, so much for this wonderful talk, and your book, which I really greatly enjoy. And I'm going to show this once again because this is completely relevant to our talks here. I don't know if you can see it, Fabricating Power with Balinese Textiles. That's what it's called. It's also really great to have all of you here. As I said earlier, you might get an email from me later with like a feedback form of sorts. And we want to continue to have these discussions. So if you have ideas, if you want to participate, if you want to engage more, please email me and let me know, or on Twitter, if you're on Twitter, we are always there. So thank you so much for joining us for the 5 talks. I hope we can have more of these conversations. And thank you. If there are other speakers in here, we're going to hang out for a little while longer, just sort of to wind down the series. You're more than welcome to join us, but thank you for coming.